It was a sleepy summer's day in my hometown when Frank Wallace opened his front door and stepped out onto the street. I was sitting on my porch opposite holding a cold bottle of beer against my cheek. It was too hot to do anything else in my humble opinion. Frank was in his 60s and had owned the bar on Main Street until he sold it last fall. He lived on his own and life as a single retired gentleman seemed to be suiting him just fine. I'd see him strolling in town with a lady on his arm or sitting in the park reading a book with a contented smile on his face. Frank was usually smartly turned out as well, favoring pressed shirts, bow ties, and waistcoats, but he was wearing a creased, collarless shirt with braces. One of the braces was unbuckled and hung loose. I thought how it wasn't like Frank to be so scruffy, but it was too hot to dwell on this, so I forgot about it and raised an arm to say hello. Frank did not acknowledge my wave. He was just standing there looking lost. This was not so easy to brush off. I was concerned. I wondered if Frank's AC was not working, if the heat was making him feel ill and he had come outside to try and find some relief. There was none to be found out on the street though. I got to my feet and called out, "Hey Frank, you okay? You want to come over for a cold one in the shade?" Frank's gaze drifted towards me. His mouth opened slightly as if he was about to say something, and then he fell to his knees. It all happened so quick. I froze for a moment in shock and then dropped my beer and started to run towards him to help. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw another one of my neighbors hurrying forwards as well. Lorna Johnson had been a nurse at a city center ER before moving to the town, and after seeing her I thought, whatever is wrong, it's going to be okay. And then Frank began to scream. It was hideous, sounding more like a wild animal crying out in fear and pain than a man. Lorna had reached Frank's side, but I could see that she was hesitating. Even with her experience as a nurse, she was clearly shocked by the way that he was screaming. But she set her face in a determined expression, put a hand on his shoulder, and began to speak to him. Frank didn't seem to know that she was there. He reached up and touched his face, and then he began to rake his fingernails down his skin, leaving vivid red lines in their wake. He raked his fingernails down again and again, and I could see blood flowing now where he was cutting open his own skin. Lorna was trying to stop him by grabbing his wrist, but he was far too strong for her. "Help me," she said. A crowd had gathered now, drawn out of their houses by Frank's hideous screams, but I realized she was speaking to me because I was the closest. I stumbled up to Frank and took a hold of one of his arms. I could see the blood and skin under his fingernails and the ragged lines of raw flesh that had been exposed in his face. A wave of nausea rushed through me, and I was fighting not to puke as I tried to help restrain Frank. We couldn't stop him though. He was frantic and kept scratching at himself viciously. It was like he was trying to claw his own skin off. "Frank, stop it," I pleaded, but he remained oblivious. His eyes were glazed over and froth was appearing at the corners of his mouth as he continued to scream and claw. Mercifully, more people were stepping up to try and help. I glanced to my side to see Bill Monroe, the deputy. He was trying to handcuff Frank and had one cuff around Frank's wrist. I put all my strength into trying to keep Frank's free arm still enough for Bill to get the other restraint on. He did, and he locked them. I breathed a momentary sigh of relief. At least Frank could not hurt himself anymore. And no matter how much he thrashed around now, the sheer weight of people holding him down was keeping him pinned to the ground. Bill said, "I'll call an ambulance, but until that gets here, I want Frank off the street, and a holding cell is the best place that I can think to put him in just now." Sweat dripped from his face as he spoke, and I could hear the tension in his voice. The worst that he usually had to deal with was traffic violations and folk who had too much to drink on a Friday night. He was out of his depth here. but he was right about the cell as far as I could see. After Doc Wilson had lost his medical license last year due to his need to keep topped up with bourbon to hold the shakes at bay, there wasn't a doctor in the town with premises that we could take Frank to. The only other alternatives left were the bar that he used to own, the store, the chapel, or one of our houses, and none of them seemed right. So, supervised by Lorna and Bill, a group of us lifted Frank and carried him the short distance to the jailhouse. He struggled less and less as we manhandled him along the street, and by the time that we arrived and put him down on a wooden bench in one of the two cells, all the fight seemed to have gone out of him. He just lay there breathing heavily while the makeshift party of concerned townsfolk dispersed. Lorna insisted on staying with Frank in the unlocked cell. I trailed after Bill to his office. I had no reason to be there apart from being badly shook up and wanting company, and Bill Monroe would have to do. He was mopping up some of the sweat from his face with a handkerchief that was already soaked wet through and making a phone call. I listened as he explained who he was and what had happened, and nodded in response to the person on the other end of the line. He had just finished the call when Lorna walked into the office. He told her, "The dispatcher said it'll be at least 2 hours before an ambulance can get here." Bill looked as if he was about to say more, but he ground to a halt. He had noticed the sadness on Lorna's face. She exhaled and said, "Frank has passed." Bill's shoulders slumped and I sat down heavily in a chair in the corner of his office. I think we both felt equally lost. Our neighbor who had been so full of life had been taken from us in such a sudden and shocking way. Lorna was clearly still thinking straight. She looked at Bill and said, "The paramedics will look after Frank's body when they arrive, but before they get here, we should take the handcuffs off. It's only right." Bill stared back at her blankly and showed no signs of moving. I guess he was so rattled he couldn't face going through to the cell and removing the handcuffs from Frank's body. Lorna held out her hand and said to him in a gentle voice, "It's okay, I'll do it." Bill gave her the keys and then sat with his head bowed until she returned. She put the handcuffs and key on the desk next to Bill and then said, "We might as well be comfortable while we're waiting for the paramedics. Would you two like to come back to my house for some iced tea?" My clothes were stuck to my skin with sweat and my mouth was parched. The idea of iced tea at Lorna's place was irresistible. I told her this, and Bill gave her a thumbs up, and the three of us set off. The heat shimmered in the street, and the skin on the back of my neck felt like it was burning. Thankfully, Lorna's place was already in sight. As we passed my house on the way, I noticed the bottle of beer that I had dropped lying on the ground and decided that I didn't have the strength to pick it up just then. I saw as well that Frank's front door was still open, and a fresh wave of sadness enveloped me as I wondered who would sort out the things that Frank had left behind. Frank had no family living in the town, but beyond that, I had no idea. I turned to Bill to ask him about Frank's next of kin, but Bill was staring back down the street at a figure walking slowly towards us. I saw who it was, and the heat of day fell away. Frank was shuffling unsteadily along. The dried blood of his self-inflicted wounds glistened darkly in the sunlight. His eyes were darker still. The sweat coating my skin felt like it had turned to ice, and I was starting to shiver violently as I said to Lorna, You made a mistake." Keeping her eyes fixed on Frank, she shook her head and replied, "The man that I left in the cell was dead. I swear on all my 30 years as a nurse that was the case. I do not know what's happening here, but it's wrong. It's against nature." I hugged myself as her words sunk in. I swallowed, desperately trying to get some moisture into my throat. I looked at Frank, at the thing that should not have been, and panic gripped me. He was coming closer. It was coming closer, and I could not move. I could not breathe. It was hot as hell in my hometown, and I was in a waking nightmare. The monster in my twisted reality opened its mouth, and a guttural groan escaped its lips. It shuffled closer, raised its arms, reaching out to me, and then its maw opened wide. Drool hung from its teeth. It was as if the rest of the world had drifted away from me and everything had focused in on the aberration that was bearing down on me. And then I heard a voice saying, "I need you to back off." I blinked, coming out of my daze, and turned and saw that Bill had his sidearm raised and aimed at the thing that Frank had become. "Please," Bill shouted. "I don't want to do this, but I will. I can't let you hurt anyone." The monster gazed at Bill. There was no humanity in its eyes. There was only rage as it threw itself at the deputy. A sharp sound made me flinch, and the monster's head was slammed backwards as a bullet struck. It fell to the ground. There was a sickening wound in the center of its forehead. Despite this, it was still twitching and clawing at the air and trying to bite even though there was nothing in reach of its teeth. And then it grew still and all the fire went out of its hideous gaze. Bill, Lorna, and I just looked at each other for a moment. I saw the shock that I was feeling reflected in their eyes. And then Bill began to shake his head. "Oh man," he said. "Oh man, I need to call this in." He holstered his sidearm, took out his phone. His hands were shaking so badly that it took him 3 goes to get the passcode right, and then he turned his back on us and walked away. I couldn't hear what was said after this, but it was an animated conversation on Bill's side. He was pointing and waving his free hand and pacing around. While he was lost in his phone call, people started to emerge cautiously from their houses. The sound of a weapon being discharged was not something that you rushed towards. I saw Mrs. Krinsky, who worked at the store, hovering by her husband's side with her hand over her mouth. Mr. Krinsky had been in the armed forces until shrapnel from an IED had shattered his kneecap, and he leaned heavily on his stick, frowning. Down the street, Jim Turner was standing framed in his doorway, blinking in the too bright light. Jim used to run an auto repair shop in town, but it had gone out of business, and now he was struggling to get by selling scrap metal and doing odd jobs where he could. Doc Wilson was out as well. He was on his porch, cradling a glass of amber liquid to his chest. There were plenty more folk joining them by now. A few had strayed as far as the street, and everybody was gawping at the figure lying on the ground. The fresh damage to its face was so bad that I wasn't sure if people would recognize that it was Frank's corpse. And if they did, I wondered if they would believe their own eyes. After all, wasn't Frank meant to be in the cell being taken care of by Lorna and the deputy? I looked back over at Bill, wishing that he would hurry up and finish his call. There would be a whole bunch of questions coming soon, and I had no answers. Finally, Bill lowered his phone and headed back. He looked around at the townsfolk and scowled. "You all need to get back inside," he said in a raised voice. "There is no danger to your health or your property, and this is a matter for the law to deal with." No one looked convinced, and Mr. Krinsky called back. "Look, Bill, none of us want to cause trouble, but there's something mighty wrong going on here." Bill glared at him, and I could see that he was fighting to keep his temper in check. He took a deep breath before replying. "I would have thought you of all people would respect the badge I'm wearing and do as you were being asked. So please." Bill left the request for Mr. Krinsky to shut up and go away hanging in the air. The veteran looked like he was going to stand his ground though, until his wife gently elbowed him in the ribs and began to lead him back inside. Bill glowered at him until he was gone, and then turned his gaze to the rest of the townsfolk who were still outside. There was plenty of muttering, but no more challenges to Bill's authority. As doors were pulled closed, Bill pinched the brow of his nose and sighed. He looked exhausted. Lorna put her hand on his arm and said, You're doing just fine, Bill. What did the sheriff say? Are they sending help? He nodded. Yes, though I'm not sure they believed me when I told them what had happened. I reckon they think the heat has got to me. Lorna smiled sympathetically and then threw a look my way as she said, We both saw the same thing and we'll tell the sheriff you saved a life here today. Now let's get this body covered up for decency's sake and go and have that drink. If you don't get some liquid inside you, Bill Monroe, seeing things will be the least of your problems. Bill managed a small smile himself at this and trudged after her into her house. I followed, not wanting to be left alone with the corpse. Soon after, all I could think about was the glass of iced tea that Lorna gave me. The three of us were in her orderly kitchen and the drink was the most wonderful, refreshing thing that had ever existed in my humble opinion. Bill looked a lot better once he had a drink as well, and he sounded calmer when he said, Yeah, once the backup and the ambulance arrive, we can start to get things back to normal. I'll drink to that, I said and raised my glass. Before it reached my lips, Lorna's door flew open and Mrs. Krinsky ran inside. My husband, there's something wrong with him. Lorna reacted first. She took Mrs. Krinsky's hands in hers and said, Tell us what happened. He was very quiet when we got inside. I thought he was angry with me for intervening and telling him to stop being so dang cranky. But he just stood there staring into space. It was like I wasn't there, and then he collapsed. She began to sob as she went on. I thought that I had lost him out there in the desert. When he came home, he promised me that we would grow old together. Please, you have to help. We will, Lorna said with remarkable calmness. I was aware of the hum of her AC, of the clock on her kitchen wall ticking quietly, of my heart beating. It was too loud, too quick. I put my hand on my chest and then I heard the scream. We all did. And I think we all knew that it was coming from the Krinsky's house. Knew that it was Mr. Krinsky who was howling in primal fear and pain, not an animal. Lorna looked at me and Bill and said, I'll stay with her, you two go. Reluctantly, I followed Bill, who was already hurrying out of the kitchen. I kept behind him as he ran towards the Krinsky's place. I wasn't a deputy and there was no way that I was going to be the first one through that door. I could see Bill standing in the kitchen as I crossed the threshold. Mr. Krinsky was on the floor close by, screaming and clawing at his skin. Bill reached for his belt where he kept his handcuffs and then cursed. He had left them back at the jailhouse. And so he grabbed Krinsky's wrists and struggled to pin them to the ground. Help me, he yelled. I moved around them both and pressed down on Krinsky's shoulders. Blood running from the wounds that Krinsky had gouged into his face, mingled with foam bubbling from his mouth. I was worried that he would choke, worried that we wouldn't be able to hold him. But we did manage to keep him from hurting himself anymore, and slowly he seemed to calm down. Eventually, he stopped struggling altogether. It's gonna be okay, there's help on the way, Bill said, trying to reassure him. Krinsky stared up. His eyes were wide with terror as he whispered in a hoarse voice. It's inside me. I have to get it out. What's inside you? Bill asked. Krinsky replied with a single word. Evil. And then he died. Bill let go of him and moved away, and I did the same. I needed to get out of there, and I started towards the door. But Bill held up a hand. Wait. We need to make sure Krinsky is not going to attack anyone if he comes back like Frank did. It should have been a crazy thought, not something that rational people believed, but I did not challenge Bill. You're going to use your sidearm, I began, thinking this was what he had meant, but he shook his head. I can't desecrate a dead body no matter what. No, we'll tie him up good and proper, make sure if something does stir, it can't go anywhere. And then he pulled over a kitchen chair and asked me to get Krinsky's body into it. The idea of touching it repulsed me. but once again, I had to do the right thing. The body was still warm and slick with sweat as we wrapped our arms around it and lifted it onto the chair. Between us, we found belts and rope and tore up blankets and fixed them around the corpse. A disgusting job, but it was done, and finally we could get out of there. There was a key inside the door, and Bill took it and locked up on the way out. As we headed back to Lorna's house, I had to force myself not to look back over my shoulder. Despite everything that we had done, I could not escape the feeling that if I did look around, I would see Mr. Krinsky shuffling unsteadily along the street. Alongside me, Bill was on his phone making a call. Well, trying to anyway. He cursed and then said, "I need to update the sheriff, but I can't get through. I've got no signal on my phone." I checked mine and it was the same, and I had no idea why. We were arriving back at Lorna's house by now. When we walked through the open door, Mrs. Krinsky was sitting at the kitchen table. She shot to her feet and asked, "Where's my husband?" Bill said in a quiet voice, "I'm sorry." Lorna sat next to Mrs. Krinsky and began to speak to her quietly, trying to console her. Bill was trying his phone again without success from the look on his face. I hugged myself. I couldn't cope with this. I wanted to crawl into a darkened room and curl up in a corner and sleep for a long time. But there was to be no hiding place, no escape. There was a scream from somewhere in the distance, a scream born of terror and hurt. And there was someone outside Lorna's kitchen window as well. It was Jim Turner. He was looking through the window at us. He looked puzzled though, as if what he was seeing made no sense to him. He put the open palm of his hand against the glass, trying to keep himself from falling, I realized, as Jim slumped forward against the window. He was still for a few seconds and then he began to scream. His spittle struck the glass as he screamed, and I felt sick knowing that, in the seconds that followed, he would start trying to pull his own skin off in a crazed attempt to get rid of the evil within him. But Jim did not dig his fingernails into his flesh. He started to smash his hands against the kitchen window again and again. Cracks appeared, and still he hammered at it, and the cracks widened. A shard of glass came free. Jim grabbed it and placed a viciously sharp edge against the skin on his face, and he began to cut. I turned away. I couldn't watch. I put my hands on my ears, desperately trying to block out the sound of his screams. I couldn't though, they were too loud. I began to sob and say to myself, "Oh, please stop, please." And Jim's screams did end. I lifted my hands free of my ears and listened for the distant scream that had preceded Jim's, but I couldn't hear anything. Whoever that had been had stopped as well. It was silence once more. I looked around the room. The broken glass that remained in the window was smeared with blood. Lorna and Mrs. Krinsky were huddled in a corner, hugging each other in a protective embrace. Bill was staring wide-eyed with fear at the door. And the thing that had been Jim Turner was dragging itself into the kitchen on its hands and knees. It looked to have sliced the skin off its own face and then cut deeper still. I could see bone in its grotesque visage. One eye was gone and gouged out, and the socket shone with blood. The other eye remained. It was darker than any night. Bill aimed his sidearm at the monster. His hand was shaking and I thought, he's going to miss. But his aim was true. The monster slumped to the ground, its fingers reached out and a low groan drifted from its lips, and then it was done. Bill wiped his hand across his forehead and said, "Lorna, where's your landline? I'm going to call 911. "Through in the front room," she replied, and took Bill through to show him. They returned a minute later. "Now the landline's down as well," Bill said. "I'm going to the jailhouse to use the radio. We are seriously in need of the cavalry." He headed for the door and Lorna and Mrs. Krinsky started to follow him. No way, I thought. "We need to stay together and wait here," I protested. "Krinsky's still out there and he will have to become one of those things." His wife looked at me and I could see the raw pain in her eyes at my words. And then she turned away from me and caught up with the others as they walked away, leaving me alone and feeling like dirt. I still wanted to stay put, but I couldn't face being on my own. I did not have any pride left to swallow at this point, and so I hurried out of the door, to find that they had halted in the street. I could see why straight away. Through the heat haze, I could make out a figure shuffling uncertainly down the street. I thought that it was Krinsky at first, and that he had freed himself from his bonds as I had feared. But it was not Krinsky. Mitch Groves had bought the bar from Frank, and he had moved from the East Coast to realize his dream of running a bar in a small town. He was going to serve homemade food and there would be a warm welcome for everyone. His dream had descended into this. He had become a monster consumed by rage, shuffling along a dusty street on a brutal summer's day. We stood and watched it. The sight of its mutilated face and dark eyes made my skin crawl. Lorna and Mrs. Krinsky moved closer to each other. Bill drew his sidearm and he fired. It fell as the others had done. It reached out one last time, and then the street was still, silent, until a new scream made me flinch. A second followed in its wake, and moments later a third and then a fourth. I could not see who was screaming or tell exactly where they were coming from. None of us could. And the screams continued to multiply until they seemed to be coming from everywhere. We were transfixed by this hideous chorus until Bill shouted, "Run! We have to get to the jailhouse before they turn." I did not need telling twice. I started to run and Bill and Lorna did the same. But Mrs. Krinsky was rooted to the spot. She was captivated by the sight of the figure stumbling out of her house. It had been her husband once. Now it was a creature that had escaped from the grip of death. If the Reaper could not hold it, why did Bill and I think belts and rags could? I thought with a bitter sigh. The monster shuffled uncertainly forwards across the porch and down onto the street. It was repulsive, but Mrs. Krinsky seemed blind to this. On this strangest of all days, I think she was seeing the man that she loved. Bill yelled at her, "We need to go." But Mrs. Krinsky ignored him, and she was crying tears of joy. Bill swore and ran towards her, and he had his sidearm, but he could not use it because of the risk of hurting her. Mrs. Krinsky held her arms out to embrace her husband. A smile spread across the monster's face. Its mouth opened and drool dripped from its teeth, and Mrs. Krinsky paused. I think the mask of her delusions must have been ripped away because she cried out in fear. It was too late though. The monster was on her and it was sinking its teeth into the flesh of her shoulder and biting deep. Bill reached them and he grabbed the monster by its scalp and neck and tried to pull it away. "Help me," he yelled. Lorna and I sprinted forwards. The monster still had its teeth buried in Mrs. Krinsky's flesh and was shaking her body like she was a rag doll. There was blood everywhere and it was spraying from the edges of the wound. Lorna began to strike the monster on the side of its head with her fist to try to make it let go. I took a hold of one of its arms and tried to pull it away, but only the monster was too strong for us. We could not stop it biting, could not stop it tearing a lump of flesh free and beginning to devour it. As it ate, it lashed out with its arms at us. It swatted us away like we were flies, and the three of us ended up on the ground. Mrs. Krinsky, released from its jaws, sunk to her knees and then toppled over. She lay sprawled on her side. Blood no longer spurted from the gaping wound in her shoulder. I had seen enough crime shows on TV to know what that meant. She was dead. Lorna linked her hand in mine and said, "We need to save ourselves now." Bill was pushing himself painfully to his feet. The monster was too busy gorging itself to notice the barrel being pointed at it. "Eat lead," Bill muttered and pulled the trigger. and then he turned and muttered in obscenity. I looked down the street and I echoed his curse. The screaming had stopped and the monsters had emerged. There were scores of them. They shuffled uncertainly along the sidewalks and down the road. They came out of buildings and groaned in the glare of the ceaseless sunlight. When they were alive, I could have put a name to every single one of them. But now I saw a disfigured horde of the dead that blocked the way. "We're not going to make it to the jailhouse," I said. Bill snapped back. "Oh, tell me something I don't know, genius." I looked around, desperately trying to find a way clear where we could try and escape. But the dead were everywhere that I could see. This was their town now, their domain. Thomas Allen had been a volunteer at the chapel. He swept the floor and brought flowers from his garden to place in vases for the services. His reanimated corpse was at the front of the horde. It was a dozen feet from us. I waited for Bill to aim and fire and to take it out, but Bill's arms were by his side. He was shaking his head. "It's over," he said. "There are too many of them." We all have our limits, and it looked like Bill had reached his. He was a broken man with seconds left to live. The monster was reaching out to Bill, opening its mouth. Bill's shoulders started to shake as he began to sob, and the sound of a shot filled the air. The thing that had been Thomas Allen spiraled backwards. The top of its skull was lost in a cloud of crimson. The monster just behind it suffered the same fate moments later. I span around. Doc Wilson was sitting on a rocking chair on his porch with a bottle of bourbon in one hand and a long-barreled weapon in the other. "I'm gonna take myself a drink before I reload, so if you folks want to head this way and join me, now would be a good time." Bill snapped out of his daze and the three of us sprinted for Doc Wilson's place. The monsters had paused for a moment to peer at the remains of their grotesque kin, but now they were on the move again. A sickening moan was escaping their curled back lips. As we reached his porch, Doc Wilson grinned and said, "I think I made him angry." And then his eyes narrowed and he growled, "Good." He slugged a bourbon from the bottle, loosed another couple of barrels, dispatched 2 more of the things, and then said, "Follow me." We followed him inside and he slammed and bolted his door. Without being asked, Bill started to drag a table over to block the door. "We need to board the windows up as well," Lorna said. Doc Wilson shook his head. "No time, the safest place is my cellar." And then he looked over at Bill, who was by the window picking up a chair for the barricade that he seemed intent on making. Doc Wilson yelled at him, "Get away from there." I don't know if Bill ever heard. The windows smashed and the dead reached through. Bill flinched and tried to get away, but the monsters had him in their grip. He cried out as they pulled him through the shattered glass, and then they fell on him in a frenzy. Bill was lost to sight, but I could see the monsters struggling over each other to reach their feast. "The cellar now," Doc Wilson yelled. "We can't help the deputy." I turned and followed him towards the cellar door. Lorna hesitated for a moment. Her face was streaked with tears. "Goodbye, my friend," she said quietly and then hurried after us. Doc Wilson ushered me through the cellar door first with Lorna on my heels. I heard the door being slammed behind me and it became too dark for me to see the stairs. I stumbled on, expecting to trip and go tumbling down at any moment, but I made it to level ground. It was darker than ever down there. To one side of me I heard Doc Wilson cussing and then saying, "Oh, there you are." A couple of seconds later, a glow appeared. It grew until I could see Doc Wilson's face. He was smiling and holding a large flashlight. "It is clockwork," he said. "Ideal when the authorities have left you high and dry." "What do you mean?" I asked. "There's no phone signal," he answered. "My landline's dead, the internet is down, and the electricity has been cut off. We've been isolated by the powers that be, so nobody can find out what's happening in this town." I had seen him drinking, and now we were in the claustrophobic cellar that I could smell the booze on his breath. And even if I hadn't, everybody knew that Doc Wilson was a hopeless drunk. The man was talking nonsense, and I needed him to see sense. "Look, Doc," I said, "Deputy Monroe called for help, and I'm sure they will be here soon. We just need to sit tight and wait for the authorities to come rescue us." He snorted with derision. "Listen to me, you fool. It's the authorities who are responsible. They tax us, they steal our personal information from our computers and phones. They put chemicals in our water, release viruses into the air, sneak subliminal messages into the information overload that surrounds us every day. We're lab rats to them, and what is happening out there is an experiment gone wrong. Now the authorities are locking this town down, and they're going to cover up this incident like they've covered up so many times before." I counted to 10 before replying in the firmest voice that I could. "That is conspiracy theory nonsense spread by people who spend too long online." Lit by the glow of his clockwork flashlight, a sad smile spread across Doc Wilson's booze-ravaged features. "If it is nonsense, why are we hiding in my cellar from crazed zombies that used to be our neighbors?" I opened my mouth to answer, but I had no answer. I had only fear as the sound of hammering on the cellar door reached me. I could hear footsteps overhead as well. The monsters who were not trying to break down the door must have been pacing up and down the floor above us, I figured. We were not safe in the cellar, we were trapped, besieged. And surely it was only a matter of time before the cellar door gave and the monsters poured down the stairs, and fresh slaughter was unleashed. Or before they found a broken floorboard and pried it free. They must have known there was living flesh close by, warm flesh running with blood that they could almost taste. Directly above my head I heard wood crack, and the hammering on the cellar door intensified. Dang critters sure are keen," Doc Wilson muttered. He was over by the shelves that lined one wall of his cellar from floor to ceiling. I saw that they were loaded with canned food and bottle after bottle of booze. He noticed me staring at him. "My personal stockpile for the end times," he said. "And though the rest of the country's probably going about its business as usual, and wishing it was time to leave work or watching the afternoon soaps, in our small corner of the USA, it's time to open a fresh bottle of 40% proof." Lorna had been listening quietly, but now she spoke out. "We can all have a drink later, but let's find a way out of here first." He looked at the bottle's side and said, "There's a metal grill over there at the top of that wall. Hasn't been opened in years and will be a mighty tight squeeze, but you're welcome to try, if you think there's still a chance of getting away from those things." Lorna's determined expression was the only answer required. Doc Wilson found a rusty screwdriver and hammering trailing spiderwebs from its handle on another shelf. He and Lorna got to work trying to force the grill. From the top of the stairs, the sound of wood splintering as the assault on the door continued was cascading down. And directly above me I could hear fingers scrabbling at the ceiling and feet stamping in a frantic beat. We were almost out of time. "Hurry up," I yelled, and then I heard a crack close by and the scraping of metal against metal. They had opened the grill. Lorna whooped in triumph and then said, "All I can see through the gap is overgrown grass, but that might give us some cover." She did not wait for a reply from either of us and pulled herself up and out. The soles of her shoes were the last thing I saw as she slipped from sight. Doc Wilson waved me forwards and I breathed my gut in, struggled through and found myself in the backyard. Lorna was crouched down and was almost hidden by these sprawling weeds. There was an ancient car tire there as well. Guess the doc was too busy preparing for the end of the world to spend time tidying up his backyard, I said with a crooked smile on my face as I untangled my limbs into a sitting position. Lorna ignored my attempted humor and shouted into the open grill, "What are you waiting for, Doc?" I couldn't see him, but I could hear Doc Wilson clearly enough as he said, I haven't helped anyone since my medical license was revoked, and it feels good to have helped you too. I'm going to keep on doing that by making a stand. Hopefully that will buy you a little time, and hopefully you will think better of me. I was a good man once." Lorna looked like she was going to try and reason with Doc Wilson, but through the open grill, I could suddenly hear the rumble of the monsters' voices. They must have broken through the cellar door and were crowding into the cellar. 2 shots broke through the guttural groans. 2 only. In my mind's eye, I saw the monsters enveloping Doc Wilson and fighting with each other to bite and feed while their hideous faces became soaked with his blood. Lorna was on her feet. "He's gone. Let's go." She kept hunched over as she scurried forwards, trying to use the cover of the overgrown backyard, I figured. I pushed myself to my feet and stood a little straighter so that I could scan the horizon. I couldn't see any monsters between the Doc's backyard and the open patch of land that led into the woods that bordered the town here. I didn't believe all the changed townsfolk had pursued us into the cellar, though. There must be more out there, I thought. They are close, about to attack. "Get down," Lorna implored, breaking the runaway train of my thoughts. I flinched, crouched, and stumbled after her until I was alongside her, but she was still looking back in the direction of Doc Wilson's house. At the open grill where the first of the monsters was crawling out after us, fresh blood stained its mouth and chin. "They are never going to give up," Lorna muttered grimly and turned away. Half a dozen clumsy steps later, and we were leaving Frank's backyard and breaking cover into open ground. I looked back over my shoulder. Monsters were streaming out of the cellar and shuffling our way. I glanced to my left. The other monsters had appeared from in between the houses, and it was the same to my right. They were converging in on us, a tidal wave of ravenous, murderous freaks. Eyes once more straight ahead, I ran as fast as I could for the woods. Lorna was 3 paces ahead of me. The trees were coming closer. We were almost there. Not that we would be out of danger when we made it to the woods, but we would no longer be so exposed. And about a mile away there was a road that cut through the woods that was busy with haulage trucks. We could flag down help. We would be saved. What was a mile, I figured? It was nothing. Even though my lungs were burning and the stitch in my chest was agonizing, I was going to make it. We were going to make it. Lorna was within touching distance of the trees, and I was right behind. And then suddenly I was falling and my foot was twisting under me. Fresh pain flared in my leg. I tumbled to the ground, rolled, and grabbed my ankle and cried out. Lorna appeared at my side, grabbed my arm, and pulled me to my feet. The weight of my injured ankle made me yell in pain. "Oh, deal with it," Lorna told me, and she was right. Gritting my teeth, I ran on into the forest. Lorna kept by my side. There were rustling sounds behind us and sharp cracks as fallen branches were stepped on. The monsters were in the woods and on our trail. We ran on through the half-light of the woods, weaving through the trees. Clouds of bugs in the humid undergrowth swarmed around us and birds shrieked overhead. Low-lying branches scratched my face and hands as I sprinted faster and faster. My ankle was numb by now, and I had given up spitting out the bugs that were ending up in my mouth. The world was a blur around me. Apart from Lorna, who was saying, "We're almost there," over and over. I believed in her. She had shown so much strength since this madness had begun. Even so, when we emerged from the trees and found ourselves in the open standing on the tarmac, I was shocked. The cacophony of the woods was gone. The sunlight was blinding. I shielded my eyes and gazed down the road. It stretched out ahead of us. I waited for a truck to roar into view so that we could flag them down and be saved. But the road in front of us was deserted and there were no sounds of any engines in the distance. I turned. The emptiness, the silence continued. And in a matter of minutes, the monsters would catch up. They would come crashing out of the woods. "We can't stay here," I said. "We're meat for the dead." No, wait, I can see something. I followed her gaze and I could see it as well. There was a vehicle coming over the horizon. It was a dark shape and it was traveling at speed. Heartbeats later, I could make out that it was a car. It was our ride out of here. I moved into the middle of the road and began to wave my arms. The car slowed and came to a halt. I lowered my arms and grinned at Lorna in relief. She smiled back as the driver and the passenger in the front seat climbed out and stood by the open doors. Both wore dark suits and shades. "Boy, are we pleased to see you," I said. "We need a ride out of here really bad. We can explain in the car." I started towards the back door, but the driver lifted his jacket to reveal a badge and holster. He said in a gravelly voice, "Federal agents, this is now a restricted zone and you two are detained." "What the?" I began to say. The passenger cut me off by shouting, "You will do what you're told." He moved towards me and produced a pair of handcuffs. "You don't understand, we're all in danger if we stay here." But he wasn't listening to me. He grabbed my wrist, and Lorna said, "They are here." Everything seemed to slow then. The passenger was opening up the handcuffs and the driver was watching. There was a sneer on his face. I turned away from both of them and looked back at the edge of the woods, where dark eyes glinted with malevolent intent. Through the corner of my eye, I was aware that Lorna was inching away from the monsters. I forced myself to do the same. The passenger did not try and stop me. He was staring at the monsters as they shuffled into the light. He looked like he had frozen with the shock. The monsters were a vision conjured from the darkest of places, and he was seeing them for the first time. So was the driver, but he was reacting by reaching into his holster. He unleashed a volley and the nearest monsters fell. They were a repulsive drop in an ocean of pain. Dozens more scrambled over the fallen bodies of their kin and threw themselves at the driver, drawn to him like scavengers to roadkill. The passenger finally came out of his daze and he drew. He took out one monster before he was overwhelmed. I saw his mouth open, but he didn't try to cry out in fear. One of the monsters had his throat gripped in its teeth, and it tore a chunk of flesh free. The passenger's final few moments of life were spent in mute terror, and the driver was lost to sight altogether under a groaning, writhing mass of the animated dead. And the monsters on the edge of the slaughter were turning to me. I looked around for Lorna, panicked again when I couldn't see her. But then I heard the car's engine kick into life and I saw that she was behind the wheel. "Get in!" And I did not need a second invitation. I made it into the passenger seat and was still pulling the door closed behind me as Lorna sped off. There was a monster in the road directly in front of us. It raised its arms and showed its drool-laced teeth. Lorna accelerated. The monster was thrown up by the impact, struck the windscreen, and then rolled away. I twisted around and looked through the back window. The monster that we had hit was struggling to its feet, and behind it, the rest of our former neighbors were shuffling along the road. One of them was holding a spine that had been stripped clean of flesh in its hand and dragging it along the ground. By my side, Lorna said, "There's no way they can catch us." The open road lay ahead of us. That should have meant the way was clear for us to find help from the authorities. Only 2 federal agents had just tried arresting us. I asked Lorna, "Do you think it's true what Doc Wilson said about the town being locked down to cover up a secret experiment?" Keeping her eyes fixed on the road, Lorna replied, "I honestly wish I could say no, but I just don't know anymore. If death is no longer the end of a physical form, then anything is possible. This is no longer the land of the free. It's the land of chaos and fear and unspeakable horror." As I considered her words, the sound of a helicopter filled the sky. A voice from above, distorted, crackled at us. "This is a restricted zone. Pull over to the side of the road." Lorna swore a stream of obscenities which translated as, "No way am I going to do that." I didn't think we had a choice. The road continued straight ahead and we could not outrun a helicopter. especially one where the crew had zero patience. It crackled overhead again. "Halt immediately or we will deploy fatal force." Lorna cussed again and turned the wheel sharply. The car left the road and we began plummeting through the woods, heading further away from our hometown. The sound of trees being shredded as the helicopter crew made good on their promise followed us as we jolted and rattled deeper into the undergrowth. Lorna swerved the wheel crazily to left and right to avoid tree trunks in our path, and I was convinced we were going to come crashing to a halt at any moment. A sickening jolt proved me right. The car had struck a tree. The front bonnet was trashed and smoke spiraled into the air. We both threw our doors open and started to stumble away. I had no idea where we were until we once more emerged from the woods. We were standing alongside the highway which had skirted our hometown. There was a small turnoff which took you into town. The highway was usually packed with fast-moving traffic, but at that moment in time, it was gridlocked in the direction of our hometown. The opposite lanes were empty. We stepped out of the woods close by a truck, and the driver was standing by his vehicle smoking a cigarette and scowling at the screen of a phone. He was a big guy with a beard and tattoos that ran up the side of his neck. Lorna approached him and asked, "What's happening?" The authorities have shut the road in both directions. They're saying there's been an explosion and the public needs to be kept away until the area is made safe. It's hogwash if you ask me." Lorna glanced at me and I could tell that we were thinking the same thing. Doc Wilson had been right. We were all pawns in a sick game being played by the powers that be. Until a few hours ago, on a sleepy summer's day in our hometown, we had believed that we were safe. Now we knew the truth. And this is my warning to you. Watch out for the signs because danger's close. Fear your neighbor and get ready to run.